Some television shows earn their contradictions slowly, one season at a time, hoping nobody notices. The Simpsons has been collecting its own logic failures for more than 3 decades, and the list is long enough to fill a night. There is the town that borders the ocean, the desert, and a mountain range simultaneously, depending entirely on which episode happens to need a coastline. There is the principal, who was never actually the principal, a man whose entire life turned out to belong to someone else. There is the woman whose deep childhood fear of flying appeared fully formed in Season 6, having apparently not existed during any of the flights she took before. There is the man who lost his hair for a different reason every time the show remembered to explain it. And there is the episode that confidently mapped out the family's entire future, and was then quietly contradicted by nearly every future set episode that came after. Welcome to Yellowfan. Let's get started. The town that can't stay still geography is the kind of thing that most towns manage to keep consistent. A town either has a harbor or it does not. A town sits near the ocean, or it sits 100 miles from the nearest coastline, surrounded by farmland and highway. A mountain range is either visible from the main street or it is not. These are simple facts. Fixed facts. The kind of thing that does not change based on what story the writers feel like telling that week. Springfield has a harbor. Springfield is landlocked. Springfield sits near a vast desert. Springfield borders dense forest. Springfield can see mountains from town. Springfield is flat in every direction. All of these statements are true. All of them are pulled from real episodes that aired across the show's many decades on television. And the remarkable thing is that none of the people who made the show ever seemed especially troubled by this. The geography of Springfield is not a mistake exactly. It is more like a policy, a decision made somewhere in the early years of the series that the town would simply be whatever the story needed it to be, and the audience would accept that arrangement because the stories were good enough to make the inconsistency feel like charm rather than carelessness. To understand how this came to be, it helps to go back to the beginning. When Matt Groening created the show, he named the town after the city of Springfield, Oregon, a real place near Portland where he grew up. He has said in interviews that when he was a child, the television sitcom called Father Knows Best was set in a town called Springfield, and he imagined that town was right next door to his hometown, close and familiar. When he grew up and realized Springfield on that show was entirely fictional, he filed the name away and used it himself years later. The reasoning was transparent and intentional. There are Springfields all across the United States. 34 states have at least one community with that name, and some states have more than one. The name, by its very abundance, would guarantee that no specific real place could claim the show as its own. Every viewer could quietly assume that this Springfield was their Springfield, the one just down the road, the one they knew. Groening has confirmed this logic directly in interviews. The design was not an accident. The town was meant to belong to everyone, which meant it had to belong to nowhere in particular. The problem with belonging to nowhere in particular is that nowhere in particular is not a real place, and real stories require real geography. As the show grew and the writing staff expanded and the years accumulated, different writers brought different instincts to the town and placed it, unconsciously or deliberately, in different physical worlds. One episode calls for a day at the beach, so Springfield has a beach. Another episode requires Homer to drive a long distance to reach the ocean, so the ocean is far away. A story needs a desert for a road trip, so the desert is nearby. A winter plot needs mountains, so the mountains appear on the horizon. Each individual episode made its own local sense. Each one chose the geography that served the comedy. The problem only emerged when all of these episodes were stacked against each other, at which point Springfield became a geographical impossibility. A town that exists simultaneously on a coastline, in the middle of a continent, adjacent to a desert, below a mountain range, near a harbor, and hundreds of miles from any navigable water. The most pointed version of this inconsistency involves the ocean. In an episode from the 11th season called The Mansion Family, the Simpson family boards a boat and sails out from Springfield Harbor into international waters. The harbor is there, the boat is there, the ocean is accessible within a short sailing distance from downtown. But a much earlier episode from the 5th season, called Boy Scouts in the Hood, shows Homer and Bart drifting out to sea after a long and winding journey that takes them well out of Springfield before they ever reach the water. These two episodes cannot both be true at the same time. Either the ocean is a short sail from the harbor, or it is an exhausting journey away. The show simply did not choose. What the Simpsons movie made of this problem is perhaps the most famous attempt to address it, and the attempt was essentially to make the joke explicit. In the movie, Ned Flanders tells Bart that Springfield is bordered by the states of Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky. Kentucky. These four states cannot share a single border point anywhere on a real American map. Ohio and Kentucky do border each other, running along the Ohio River. But Maine is in the northeast corner of the country, and Nevada is in the far west. And placing them in the same neighborhood as Ohio and Kentucky produces a state configuration that could not exist in the physical world as it is arranged. The filmmakers knew this. The joke was that anyone who tried to find the real Springfield was welcome to try, and good luck to them. The contradiction was dressed up as a punchline, which is perhaps the most Simpsons solution imaginable. Name the impossibility, make it funny, move on. The nuclear power plant that Homer works at has its own version of this problem. In early episodes, the plant sits on the edge of town, somewhere far enough from the residential areas that Homer has a real commute. In later episodes, the cooling towers are visible from the Simpson family's neighborhood, looming in the near distance. The plant moves across Springfield depending on what the story needs. When an episode wants to explore Homer's commute, the plant is far away. When an episode wants a background visual of industrial Springfield visible from the family's street, the cooling towers are right there on the horizon. The plant is never in the same place twice in any consistent way, though it carries the visual authority of an established landmark in every scene it appears. The school has its own inconsistencies. Springfield Elementary was painted yellow in some episodes and white in others, with the color occasionally switching mid-episode in the early seasons. The building's position relative to other Springfield landmarks shifted over time. The producers eventually settled on yellow as the official color and even slipped in a visual joke, placing a framed picture of the old white school in Principal Skinner's office, as if the building had been repainted and the former version was now a historical artifact. It was a small, quiet acknowledgement of the problem, resolved not by retracing steps, but by folding the mistake into the world and giving it a story. The Simpson family's own home is not immune. The basement of the house has an entrance that moves from episode to episode, sometimes located in the hallway near the kitchen and garage, sometimes in the foyer near the main staircase. The interior layout of the house changes to accommodate different plots. Rooms expand or contract. Walls appear and disappear. The address of the house has been stated at different points as 742 Evergreen Terrace, which is the version most viewers accept as definitive, but the number has also appeared on screen as 94,555,000, 723,1094, and on one occasion as 430 Spalding Way, an entirely different street. In one episode, the number 742 Evergreen Terrace was shown to be a completely different house from the one the Simpsons lived in, which creates the unsettling possibility that somewhere in Springfield there is another house at that address, and the show has at various times accidentally filmed both of them. West Springfield, which is the western portion of the town, was described in one episode as being 3 times the size of Texas. Texas is the second largest state in the United States by area. 3 times Texas would make West Springfield larger than most countries on Earth. The joke was never meant to be taken literally, of course, and nobody did take it literally, because the show had long since established that its geography existed on its own terms, and the audience had accepted those terms. But the statement, considered alongside all the other contradictions, adds a specific flavor of absurdity to the whole question. Springfield is a town that has a desert and an ocean and a mountain range and a harbor that sits at the intersection of 4 impossible neighboring states, that has a western district larger than the second biggest state in the country, and that nobody can find on any map because it does not exist anywhere except in the logic of whatever story the writers needed to tell that week. There is something genuinely appealing about this, once a person stops expecting consistency and simply accepts the town for what it is. Springfield works not because it is a real place, but because it is a complete place. Every element of its geography, however contradictory, carries the weight of a real location. The harbor feels like a real harbor. The mountains feel like real mountains. The desert feels like a real desert. The school feels like a real school, even when its color changes and its position shifts. The world of the show has a texture and a density that makes it feel lived in. And that feeling of being lived in is more powerful than any map could be. A map would ruin it. A map would force choices the show was never willing to make and never needed to make, because the audience never needed a map. The audience needed a town. And Springfield is, by almost any measure, one of the most fully realized fictional towns in the history of American television, even if no one could ever say with confidence which direction the ocean was from downtown. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Springfield is a town that can border an ocean and be landlocked at the same time, sit near mountains and a desert and a harbor all at once, and somehow feel completely real despite none of it adding up. Next, the show turns turns this same logic on its main character, and the question of how old Homer Simpson actually is becomes one of the stranger mysteries in all of television. Section 2. The Man Who Was Never Born. Start with something simple: a man's age. A number that should be easy to track, easy to confirm, the kind of basic biographical fact that a television show about a specific family ought to be able to keep straight across its many years on the air. Homer Simpson has a birthday. He has a driver's license. He has been on screen, in front of hundreds of millions of viewers, for more than 3 decades. And in all that time, the show has never once managed to agree on how old he is. The first number attached to Homer's age comes from the very early episodes of the series, the ones that aired when the show was still finding its footing, and the animation was rougher, and the character voices were slightly different from what they would eventually become. In those early episodes, Homer is described as 34 years old. That number appears, it is noted, and then the show moves forward. By the time the 4th season arrived, Homer was no longer 34. Without any explanation, without any story acknowledging the shift, he had become 36. Then, in the 8th season, he was described as 38 and 39, sometimes within the same season, occasionally within episodes that were not separated by much time at all. By the 18th season, a number appeared on screen that placed him at 40. The progression has a rough logic to it. As the show aged, Homer aged alongside it, at least partially. The writers who were in the room during the 7th and 8th seasons have spoken about this, noting that as they themselves grew older, Homer seemed to drift upward with them, the way a character absorbs something of the people who are writing him without anyone making a deliberate decision about it. The driver's license is where the inconsistency becomes most concrete and most visible. In the 4th season episode called Duffless, Homer's driver's license appears on screen long enough to be clearly read. The birth date listed is May 12, 1956. This is a real date, placed into the show as a real fact about the character, not a joke date or a placeholder. If Homer was born on May 12, 1956, and the 4th season ran across 1992 and 1993, then he would have been 36 or 37 years old during that period, which aligns roughly with the number the show was using at the time. The license exists, the date was shown, it was, for one moment, an anchor. But an anchor only holds if the ship agrees to stay in one place, and the show had no interest in staying anywhere. The floating timeline, as the people behind the series have come to call it, means that the show is always set in the present, always in whatever year the episode happens to be airing, and the characters' pasts are quietly adjusted to match. Homer met Marge in high school. That has been established multiple times, but the year of that meeting drifts. In the 2nd season episode called The Way We Was, the story is clearly set in 1974. Homer and Marge are high school seniors, meeting in detention, falling awkwardly into each other's lives at a very specific moment in American cultural history, with the details of the period carefully rendered in the background. If they were seniors in 1974, they were born around 1956 or 1957, which lines up almost perfectly with the driver's license date. Then the 19th season aired an episode called That 90s Show, and the calculation collapsed completely. That episode placed Homer and Marge as a childless couple in their 20s during the early 1990s. Not in 1974. Not as teenagers meeting in detention. Homer in that episode is inventing grunge music, which is a joke that only works if he is a young adult during the period when grunge was happening, which was the early 1990s. Marge in that episode is attending Springfield University, having never been pregnant with Bart. If Homer was a young man in his 20s in the early 1990s, he was born sometime around 1970, which makes him 14 years younger than the driver's license suggested, and makes the 1974 high school meeting with Marge completely impossible, since he would have been approximately 4 years old. The arithmetic does not work. The show simply chose a different decade, and hoped the warmth of the nostalgia would carry the audience past the contradiction. Even within seasons that make no attempt to push the timeline, Homer's age drifts in smaller ways. During a season 34 episode, Homer makes a joke about not knowing whether he was 2 or 30 in 1986, which is the show openly acknowledging that the question no longer has a real answer. The writers know the number is gone. They know the date on the license and the birthdays that have accumulated, and the various decades that have been claimed as Homer's formative years cannot all be true at once. So they turn the confusion into a joke. Homer himself does not know. The character and the show arrived at the same place together, which is a kind of honesty, even if it arrived by accident. Then the 32nd season produced an episode called Do Pizza Bots Dream of Electric Guitars, which reimagined Homer's adolescence as happening in the 1990s rather than the 1970s, adding another layer to the confusion. And the 36th season episode called Shoddy Heat showed Homer as a child of around 8 or 10 years old old in 1982, which would make his birth year somewhere in the early 1970s, which contradicts the driver's license by roughly 15 years, and contradicts that 90s show by roughly a decade, and contradicts the 1974 high school graduation by a significant enough margin to make all three versions of the same man's life feel like they belong to different people entirely. The showrunner Matt Selman has explained this directly, describing the show's approach to its own continuity as an elastic canon, a phrase that acknowledges the problem without apologizing for it. The canon stretches. It does not hold a fixed shape. It accommodates what the story needs and releases what the story cannot use. And the audience, by and large, has decided to go along with this because the show has earned that flexibility through the quality of the individual episodes, even when those episodes cannot agree on something as basic as how old the man at the center of them actually is. What makes Homer's age especially rich as a failure of logic is that the show did try, at certain moments, to provide real answers. The driver's license was a real attempt. The 1974 graduation was a real attempt. These were not throwaway gags designed to be ignored. They were written into the series as genuine biographical facts about the character, placed there with enough care that they appeared on screen long enough to be read and noted. The problem is that a show running for decades accumulates too many of these real attempts, and the real attempts eventually contradict each other, and at that point, the only options are to fix the continuity, to ignore it, or to make the contradiction itself into a joke. The Simpsons, over its long run, has tried all three approaches, sometimes in different episodes and sometimes in the same episode depending on the scene. Maggie's age carries a version of the same problem that is even more extreme in some ways, because Maggie's existence as a perpetual infant makes the contradictions especially visible. Maggie is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old since 1989. If she aged normally, she would be a grown adult well into her 30s. The show obviously never intended for her to age, and the audience never expected it. But flash-forward episodes and flashback episodes have placed her birth at different moments in history, making her, depending on the episode, either a child born during the late 1980s when the show began, or a child born during the 2020s, decades later. In a season 36 episode called Maggie Origins, her conception is placed in a recent time frame consistent with the current period when the episode aired. If she was conceived recently, she was born recently, which means she is genuinely an infant in the current year of the show, which means she was not a baby in 1989, which means the versions of baby Maggie from the first season are set more than 30 years before the versions of baby Maggie from the recent seasons, which is not how babies work, but is very much how the elastic canon works. Grandpa Simpson, who is Homer's father, carries his own age problems through the series. He is old. He has always been old. But how old and what events in his life happened when shifts across the decades of the show. His military service, which is established early on as a formative part of his life, has been placed at different points in history in different episodes. The specific conflict he served in has shifted. The approximate year of his birth, working backward from the events attributed to his past, produces different answers depending on which set of episodes is treated as authoritative. The show has, on multiple occasions, shown Grandpa as a young man in flashback, and the decades in which those flashbacks are set have not always been consistent with each other or with his stated age in the present-day episodes. Ned Flanders was revealed in an episode from the 10th season to be 60 years old. The episode made this a major plot point, presenting Ned's age as shocking information because he appears so youthful and energetic. 60 was treated as an advanced age that explained certain things about his character and surprised the people around him. The problem is that this revelation contradicts other episodes that show Ned as a young child in flashbacks described as taking place roughly 30 years before the present, which would have made him approximately 30 years old during those earlier present-day scenes rather than 60. The gap between 30 and 60 is large enough that it cannot be explained away by a generous margin of error. The show simply needed Ned to be 60 for one particular episode, assigned him that age, and did not go back to check whether it fit. What all of this adds up to, across every shifted number and contradicted birth date and moving reference point, is a picture of a show that was never truly designed to carry a fixed timeline across its entire run. The show was designed to be funny in individual moments, and the individual moments were designed to need whatever they needed, and if what they needed one week contradicted what the show had established the week before or the decade before, that was a problem for a different writer on a different day. The showrunners who have spoken about this have been largely honest about it. The elastic canon is not an accident. It is the operating principle of a show that has run so long that consistency and longevity became genuinely incompatible, and the show chose longevity. Homer is 30 34. Homer is 36. Homer is 38. Homer is 40. Homer was born in 1956 and graduated high school in 1974 and was a young man in 1992 and was a child in 1982. All of these things are true within the world of the show, and none of them are reconcilable with each other, and somehow the man himself, Homer J. Simpson, remains one of the most recognizable characters in the history of American entertainment. Instantly legible to anyone who sees him regardless of what year the calendar says it is, or how old the license in his wallet claims he is. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Homer's age has no fixed answer, his birthday no fixed year, and his past no stable decade to call home. The timeline of the man simply floats, accommodating whatever the story needs. Next, the show takes that same problem and applies it to something much more central than a birth year. It applies it to the entire origin story of the Simpson family itself, and the damage that does to what many people consider the most beloved episodes ever made. Section 3. The origins that keep rewriting themselves among the many things the show has done well across its long run. The early flashback episodes occupy a special category. They are not simply good episodes, they are foundational ones. They answered questions that the audience had been carrying since the beginning. Questions about how these two particular people found each other, how they ended up in that yellow house on Evergreen Terrace with 3 children and a dog, and a life that was ordinary in all the ways that made it extraordinary to watch. The episodes that told the origin story of Homer and Marge are among the most emotionally resonant half hours the show ever produced, and for a long stretch of the series, they sat at the center of what made the whole thing feel true. When the show eventually rewrote them, the reaction from the audience was not simply disappointment. For many people who had grown up with the show, it felt like something closer to a betrayal. The first piece of the origin story arrived in the second season, in an episode called The Way We Was. The premise was simple. The family's television breaks down on a winter evening, and with nothing to watch, Marge and Homer take turns telling their children how they first met. The story goes back to 1974. Both Homer and Marge are seniors at Springfield High School. Homer is caught smoking in the restroom alongside his friend Barney and is sent to detention. Marge is caught participating in a feminist protest and is sent to the same detention. Homer sees Marge for the first time across that detention room and falls immediately, completely, helplessly in love. He invents a reason to spend time with her, claiming to need tutoring in French, and she agrees to help him. What follows is a careful, genuinely sweet portrait of a teenage boy trying to deserve someone he has decided is the most important person he has ever seen, failing repeatedly in the ways that young people fail, and eventually being rewarded not through any great achievement but simply through sincerity. Marge goes to the prom with another boy, a confident and articulate young man named Artie Ziff, who is everything Homer is not. The evening ends badly when Artie reveals himself to be less decent than his confidence suggested. Marge walks home from the prom and finds Homer waiting on the doorstep, having walked there alone after being stood up. They sit together on the step. A song by the Carpenters plays. Something real begins. The episode was loved. It is still loved. Part of what made it work so well was the specificity of the period detail and the emotional clarity of the central situation. Homer in 1974 is recognizably Homer. He has the same impulses, the same social blindness, the same underlying warmth underneath all the foolishness. Marge in 1974 is recognizably Marge. She is thoughtful and principled and slightly formal even as a teenager, with the blue hair already in place and the careful manner already fully formed. The 1974 setting did not feel arbitrary. It grounded the characters in a specific cultural moment that made sense of who they were. These were people shaped by a particular era, and the show respected that shaping. 2 further episodes built on that foundation. The third season produced I Married Marge, which picked up the story after the courtship and told how Homer and Marge navigated an unplanned pregnancy in 1980 and built a life together under significant financial pressure. The 5th season produced And Maggie Makes 3, which told the story of Maggie's birth and the sacrifice Homer made to afford a larger family. Together, these 3 episodes formed something close to a complete origin story for the Simpson family, a trilogy of linked half-hours that explain not just how these characters met, but why they stayed together, what the marriage cost them, and what it meant to them. Critics and fans have referred to these episodes collectively as among the finest work the show ever produced. They were the emotional bedrock on which a great deal of the audience's affection for the family rested. Then the 19th season arrived with an episode called That 90s Show, and that bedrock cracked. The episode begins with Bart and Lisa finding a university diploma belonging to Marge, which prompts a flashback. Canonically, Marge never attended university. family. She became pregnant with Bart shortly after finishing high school and built her life around the family rather than further education. The diploma is already a problem before the flashback even begins, but the flashback is where the real damage occurs. The story places Homer and Marge as a young childless couple in the early 1990s. Homer is paying Marge's tuition at Springfield University, where she falls under the influence of a professor who represents everything Homer is not: intellectual, confident in an academic way, and interested in Marge as a person capable of ideas. Marge begins to drift toward this professor. Homer, heartbroken and at loose ends, forms a band. The band becomes unexpectedly successful. Homer, specifically, is credited in the episode with essentially inventing the grunge movement, a joke that requires him to be a young man in exactly the years when grunge was emerging from Seattle, which was the early 1990s. The problems here are not subtle. The way we was established that Homer and Marge met in 1974 as high school seniors. I Married Marge established that Marge became pregnant with Bart in 1980. If both of those episodes are true, Homer and Marge spent the 1990s as a married couple with 3 children living in the house on Evergreen Terrace, not as a young childless couple navigating a first serious relationship while Homer accidentally created an entire music genre. The two versions of their past cannot be reconciled. They do not overlap in a way that leaves room for both. One story has to be true and the other has to be wrong, and the 19th season episode did not acknowledge this tension in any way. It simply told a different story about the same people, as if the earlier stories did not exist. The fan response was significant and largely negative. Commentators who covered the show described the episode as one of the most actively resented in the series' later run, not because the episode itself was without any merit, but because it required the audience to set aside things they genuinely loved in order to accept it. The emotional weight of the 1974 detention room scene, the Carpenter's song on the porch, the careful portrait of 2 young people finding each other in a specific and believable moment, all of that was retroactively unmade by an episode that needed Homer to be young in 1992 for the sake of a grunge joke. One academic analysis of the episode described it as a failed attempt to demonstrate the show's continued relevance through nostalgia for a different decade, and noted that fans were not simply upset about the changed dates on a calendar. They were upset because the original episodes had done something real, had made them feel something genuine about these characters, and the new episode had treated that reality as expendable. The writers behind the show have offered various explanations for why the floating timeline makes these contradictions inevitable. The characters are always the same age. The show is always set in the present. The past adjusts to match. This is a coherent philosophy for managing a show that has been running for decades without aging its cast, and in most circumstances it operates quietly enough that the audience accepts it without much friction. The problem with that 90s show was that it did not operate quietly. It went directly into territory that the audience cared about most: the origin story, the foundational emotional episodes, and replaced what was there with something that served a different creative purpose entirely. The philosophy was not wrong, but the application was painful. A later episode from the 15th season, called The Way We Weren't, added yet another layer to the origin story by introducing a childhood connection between Homer and Marge that predated their 1974 meeting in detention. In this version, the two of them met as children at a summer camp, though neither knew the other's name or ever saw each other again until high school. Homer had been carrying a memory of a girl from camp for years before the detention room moment. This retcon is gentler than the one in that 90s show. It does not contradict the 1974 story, but adds to it, extending the connection between the two characters further back into their pasts, and giving the love story an additional layer of destiny. Critics and fans responded to it more warmly, in part because it enriched rather than replaced what existed before. Adding a chapter is different from erasing one, but even this gentler addition created its own small inconsistencies. The summer camp flashback sits in a slightly different relationship to the established timeline depending on which version of Homer's childhood is being used as the reference point, and since Homer's childhood has been placed at different points in history in different episodes, the summer camp story floats alongside all the other floating elements without ever settling into a fixed position in the sequence of events. What these accumulated rewrites reveal is something about the nature of long-running serialized storytelling and its relationship with its own past. A show that runs for 35 years accumulates history whether it wants to or not. Characters build up context, moments build up meaning, audiences build up attachment, and the history that accumulates is not neutral. Some of it is load-bearing, some of it holds up other things. The 1974 origin story was load-bearing in a way that a geography joke about the ocean being near or far was not, moving the ocean from one side of Springfield to the other causes no emotional damage because nobody loved the ocean's position. Moving Homer and Marge's first meeting from 1974 to the 1990s causes real damage because millions of people loved that detention room, loved the Carpenter's song, loved the specificity of that particular year as the place where the family's story began. The show has, in more recent seasons, largely stopped trying to fix this. The concept of the elastic canon, acknowledged openly by the current showrunner, amounts to a formal acceptance that the origin story no longer has one fixed version, and perhaps never needed to. Different episodes can tell different versions of how Homer and Marge came together, and the audience can hold whichever version they prefer as the real one, since the show itself is not going to arbitrate the question. This is a practical solution. It is also, in a quiet way, a kind of surrender, an acknowledgement that the original episodes built something that subsequent episodes eroded, and that the erosion cannot now be undone, only managed. For the audience members who came to the show in its early years, and who love those foundational episodes most deeply, the management may never feel quite like enough. The detention room in 1974 meant something specific. The Carpenter's song on the porch meant something specific. The careful, grounded, emotionally precise portrait of two young people in a particular American moment meant something specific. That specificity was always going to be vulnerable to a show that preferred to float. Eventually, the floating reached it, and the town on the screen remained recognizably Springfield, and the characters remained recognizably Homer and Marge, but somewhere in the rearrangement, a piece of the origin story that had felt permanent quietly became one version among several, which is not quite the same thing as permanent at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The origin story of Homer and Marge has been told in 1974, in 1980, and in the early 1990s, and no single version of those events can be reconciled with all the others. The couple's past is as elastic as the town they live in. Next, the show performs the same operation on one of its most carefully developed supporting characters, and the result is the single most controversial episode in the show's entire run. Section 4, The Man Who Didn't Exist. For the first 8 seasons of the show, Principal Seymour Skinner was one of the most fully realized supporting characters in Springfield. He was not simply a background figure who wandered in and out of school-related plots. He was a person with a genuine history, a specific psychology, and a set of relationships that had been built slowly and carefully across hundreds of episodes. He was a Vietnam veteran, shaped by that experience in ways the show explored with some seriousness. He lived with his mother Agnes, a difficult and demanding woman who had never quite let him become independent in the way that a man in his 40s might reasonably expect to be. He had a romantic connection with the 4th grade teacher Edna Krabappel that flickered and deepened across many seasons. He had rivalries and loyalties, and a particular brand of anxious dignity that made him genuinely funny in a way that depended on the audience knowing who he was. The comedy of Skinner came from the gap between how seriously he took himself and how little the world around him cooperated with that seriousness. That gap required a real character to exist on one side of it, and for 8 seasons, a real character did. Then the 9th season aired its 2nd episode. The episode was called The Principal and the Pauper, and it dismantled everything that had been built about Seymour Skinner in a single half hour. The episode begins at a celebration marking the 20th anniversary of Skinner's time as principal of Springfield Elementary. The town has gathered to honor him. The mood is warm and ceremonial, and then a stranger arrives. The stranger is a man who introduces himself as Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner. He presents documents, he tells a story, and the story he tells is this: the man the town has known as Seymour Skinner for 20 years is not Seymour Skinner at all. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. He grew up as a street tough in Capital City, the kind of young man with no particular direction and a talent for minor trouble. Facing the prospect of a jail sentence for his behavior, he was given the option of enlisting in the army, and he took it. In the army, he was assigned to serve under a commanding officer named Seymour Skinner, who was everything Armin was not: disciplined, principled, dedicated, the kind of man who knew what he believed and acted accordingly. Skinner became a mentor to Armin, and Armin admired him genuinely. Then, on a mission, Skinner disappeared. Armin assumed he was dead. He came to Springfield to inform Skinner's mother Agnes of the loss, and Agnes, confused or in denial or simply unwilling to accept the truth, believed she was speaking to her son. Armin, unwilling to cause her further pain, went along with the mistake. He assumed the identity. He built a life inside it. He became, over 20 years, the principal that Armin Tamzarian never would have been, the responsible adult that Seymour Skinner's example had shown him it was possible to become. It is, when described this way, almost a moving story. story, a man remade by grief and compassion into something better than what he started as. But the execution of the episode did not play it as a moving story. It played it as a twist, a revelation designed to shock, and the reaction it produced in a significant portion of the audience was not the complex emotional response the premise might have warranted, but something closer to simple anger. Because the twist did not exist in isolation. It existed in the context of 8 seasons of episodes that had shown Seymour Skinner growing up in Springfield, attending school there, having a father whose name was Sheldon Skinner, sharing history with Springfield residents going back to his childhood. None of that was possible if Skinner was actually Armin Tamzarian, a man from Capital City who had arrived in Springfield only 20 years ago as an adult. The backstory the episode invented for the character contradicted the backstory the show had been building for him across hundreds of episodes over 8 years. The specific contradictions are numerous and pointed. One much discussed example involves an earlier episode in which Skinner's father, referred to as Sheldon Skinner, appears in a flashback alongside Grandpa Simpson during a wartime sequence. Sheldon Skinner sounds like the Seymour Skinner the audience knows. He looks like him. He is presented as his father. If Skinner is actually Armin Tamzarian and has no connection to the Skinner family, then this father simply cannot exist in the way the earlier episode showed him. Another contradiction involves an episode in which Skinner re-enlists in the army and is referred to by military personnel as Sergeant Seymour Skinner. If the real Seymour Skinner was a military figure and Armin was an imposter who assumed his name only after leaving the military, the army referring to Armin by that name in a military context creates its own logical problem that the episode never addresses. There are further examples involving Skinner's interactions with Ned Flanders, interactions that the Armin Tamzarian backstory suggests should not have happened, and his general familiarity with Springfield that extends further back than 20 years in ways the episode's premise cannot accommodate. The writing staff behind the episode has spoken about it over the years, and the explanations offered have been candid to the point of being almost surprising. Ken Keeler, who wrote the episode, has acknowledged in interviews that he knew the continuity problems were real and chose to proceed anyway because the story interested him. The ending of the episode, in which the town of Springfield decides it would rather have Armin back than the real Seymour Skinner, effectively orders reality to rearrange itself. A judge issues a ruling that legally changes Armin Tamzarian's name to Seymour Skinner. The name Armin Tamzarian is declared officially unutterable in Springfield under penalty of torture. The real Seymour Skinner is placed on a train and sent away, and life in Springfield returns to exactly what it was before the revelation, as if the revelation never happened. The episode essentially ended by instructing itself to be forgotten. The audience largely obliged, but not without registering the wound. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner and several other major characters, has been particularly open about his feelings regarding the episode. He has described it as a mistake, and expressed that he felt it fundamentally damaged a character he had invested significant creative energy in building over many years. His feelings on the matter are not a minor footnote. Shearer is one of the central creative contributors to the show's voice, and his specific objection that the episode casually destroyed something real carried weight precisely because he had been present for all the seasons of work that built what was destroyed. What the show did with the Tamzarian revelation afterward is revealing in its own way. Almost immediately, subsequent episodes began quietly behaving as though The Principal and the Pauper had never aired. Flashback episodes continued to show Skinner as a lifelong Springfield resident. Episodes set Agnes Skinner pregnant with a young Seymour, growing him inside the Springfield she had always inhabited. The mother-son relationship between Agnes and the man everyone called Skinner was written as a relationship with genuine deep history, not one that began 20 years ago when a stranger arrived from Capital City to deliver bad news. The show undid its own episode not through any formal acknowledgement, but through the simple accumulation of contradicting material, episode by episode, until the weight of everything that ignored the Tamzarian twist far exceeded the weight of the single episode that had introduced it. There was one notable exception to this pattern of quiet erasure. In a 15th season episode, Lisa refers to Skinner by his original name, calling him Principal Tamzarian, at a moment when the show is making a self-aware joke about its own habit of resetting major changes within a single episode. The reference is a wink. The show acknowledging that it knows what it did and knows what it then chose to do about it. The wink is funny precisely because it requires the audience to remember something the show otherwise spent years trying to make them forget. That double awareness, the awareness of the twist and the awareness of the forgetting, is the show at its most honestly contradictory. What makes the Skinner situation philosophically interesting, beyond the simple question of continuity, is what it reveals about how character actually works in long-running television. A character like Skinner is not simply a collection of biographical facts. His name, his backstory, his family history are not the essential thing. The essential thing is the accumulated texture of how he has appeared across hundreds of episodes, the jokes that have been built around him, the relationships that have developed, the specific rhythm of the performance, the particular anxious energy that Harry Shearer brings to the role. All of that survived the Tamzarian episode intact, because none of it actually depended on the character's real name being Seymour Skinner. The comedy of his relationship with Agnes did not require him to have been her biological son. The comedy of his rivalry with Superintendent Chalmers did not require him to have grown up in Springfield. What those things required was consistency of personality and relationship, and those things the show maintained, because the writers who came after the principal and the pauper had the sense to understand that character is something deeper than a name or an origin story. Ned Flanders also carries a version of this problem, though it received far less attention than the Skinner situation. In a 10th season episode called Viva Ned Flanders, the episode's central joke is built on the revelation that Ned is 60 years old despite appearing much younger, a discrepancy the episode attributes to his having never done anything sinful or impulsive in his life. 60 is presented as a shocking number. The episode leans on the audience's surprise at it, but earlier episodes had shown Ned as a young child in flashback sequences described as taking place roughly 30 years before the present, which would require him to be approximately 30 years old during seasons in which he was already a settled middle-aged homeowner with 2 children. The gap between 30 and 60 is not a small rounding error, it is the difference between 2 entirely different phases of a human life, and the show simply needed a different number for one episode and used it. The broader pattern that emerges across all of these cases, Skinner's invented identity, Ned's impossible age, Homer's shifting birth date, Marge's retroactively introduced university degree, is not one of carelessness exactly. Individual episodes were written with care. Individual jokes were constructed thoughtfully. What the pattern reveals is instead a fundamental structural reality about the kind of show The Simpsons is. Each episode was, especially in the earlier seasons, conceived and written largely as its own self-contained unit. The writers were trying to make a great half hour of television, and the great half hour of television they were trying to make was the one in front of them right now, not the theoretical perfect arrangement of all previous half hours into one consistent whole. Continuity across episodes was a secondary concern, always, to the quality of the episode being made. And when continuity and quality were in direct tension, as they were in The Principal and the Pauper, the show chose quality of individual execution over respect for accumulated history, and lived with the consequences. Whether that choice was right is a question the show's audience has been arguing about since 1997. The episode is still widely cited as one of the most controversial in the show's history, not because it is unwatchable, but because it asked the audience to accept something that cost them something real, and then ended by pretending the cost had never been incurred. Springfield moved on. Armin Tamzarian's name was declared unutterable. The train carrying the real Seymour Skinner rolled away into the distance, and the next week, without ceremony, the principal was back at his desk, anxious and slightly absurd and entirely himself, the same man he had always been, as if nothing had happened at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Skinner's entire identity was rewritten in a single episode, and then quietly unwritten across the seasons that followed, until the show had effectively erased its own most controversial revelation without ever formally admitting it had done so. Next, the show performs a similar disappearing act with one of its most beloved female characters, and the fear that was never there before suddenly appears, fully formed, in a season 6 episode that pretends the previous seasons never happened. Section 5. The Woman Who Was Never Afraid. There is a particular kind of story that television tells well, and it is the story of a hidden thing coming into the light. A character who has been carrying something private finally stops carrying it alone. The audience learns something about a person they thought they knew, something that reframes earlier moments and gives the character new depth. When this kind of story is done well, the revelation feels earned. It feels like something that was always true, waiting to be discovered, and the discovery makes the character more complete rather than less consistent. The show does this kind of story with Marge Simpson in a 6th season episode called Fear of Flying, and the episode is genuinely good. The therapy scenes are warm and funny. The guest performance by Anne Bancroft as a psychiatrist named Dr. Swag is one of the finest single-episode guest appearances in the show's history. The emotional resolution, such as it is, lands with real feeling. The episode is loved, and it deserves to be loved. The problem is the math. Marge Simpson, as established in Fear of Flying, has a deep and debilitating debilitating fear of airplanes. The fear is not mild. It is not a vague discomfort or a tendency to grip the armrest a little harder than necessary. It is a fully developed phobia with roots in childhood trauma, a fear so severe that when the family boards a plane near the beginning of the episode, Marge has a complete panic attack before the plane has even left the gate. She demands to be let off. She cannot function. The episode then traces the origin of this phobia back through her childhood, through a series of incidents involving planes and flight, and a specific formative moment involving her father, who she believed was a pilot, but who turned out to be a flight attendant, a revelation that shattered an image she had built her early sense of security around. The fear is presented as something deep and old and central to who Marge is, something that has been part of her the entire time, even before the audience ever met her. This is where the math becomes a problem. Fear of Flying aired in December of 1994, during the 6th season of the show. By that point, the Simpson family had already traveled by airplane on multiple occasions. They had flown to Washington, D.C. in a 3rd season episode called Mr. Lisa Goes to Washington, a family trip centered on a national essay competition that Lisa enters. The family boards a plane. They fly across the country. Marge is on that plane. She is calm. She is engaged with her family and the trip. There is no panic attack at the gate, no sweating in the cabin, no evidence whatsoever of a phobia so severe that it would later require professional therapeutic intervention to approach. She simply flies. Then the plane lands, and the trip continues, and Marge's relationship with air travel produces no notable drama because, in that episode, she has no notable relationship with air travel. She is a person who can fly on a plane without incident, because at that point in the show's history, the writers had not yet decided she would be a person who could not. The inconsistency compounds when the episode that immediately follows Fear of Flying in the broadcast order is considered. Bart vs. Australia, which aired in February of 1995, only a few months after Fear of Flying established Marge's severe aerophobia, shows the family flying to Australia. Marge is on this flight. She is fine. The aerophobia that had just been explored in careful therapeutic detail, that had been traced back to a specific childhood wound, that had required a professional to help her begin addressing, produces no visible distress during a transatlantic journey to the other side of the world. She boards the plane. She sits in her seat. She endures the journey, presumably without incident, because the episode is about Bart's dealings with the Australian government and not about Marge's psychological state, and so Marge's psychological state simply reverts to whatever the episode needs it to be. Fans who have examined this sequence of episodes closely have offered various attempts at resolution. One argument suggests that Marge's panic attack in Fear of Flying was triggered specifically by the moment before takeoff, before the plane leaves the ground, and that once airborne she is capable of managing the anxiety. This reading notes that in the episode itself, the panic attack happens while the plane is still on the ground, still taxiing, and that the scenes of her flying in earlier episodes begin after the plane is already in the air. This is a generous interpretation and it has a certain internal logic to it, but it requires the phobia to be a very specific and somewhat unusual form, one that manifests at the gate and during taxi but not during flight itself, which is not quite how the episode frames the fear. The episode frames it as a deep and comprehensive avoidance of flight in general, rooted in the association between planes and a foundational childhood disappointment, not as a fear specifically triggered by the transition from ground to air. Another argument, offered by some viewers, is that phobias can be selective and inconsistent, appearing in some contexts and not others, and that a person with a flying phobia might manage fine on some occasions and completely fall apart on others depending on circumstances. This is actually true of phobias as a class of psychological experience. They are often context-dependent and inconsistent in ways that can look like contradiction from the outside, but this defense requires a level of psychological nuance that the show itself does not apply. The show does not present Marge's fear as something that comes and goes. It presents it as a hidden but constant thing, a deep background presence in her life that finally emerged into the foreground when the family happened to have plane tickets. The framing of the episode is that this fear has always been there, not that it appeared on this particular occasion. What is more likely, and what the commentators who have written about this inconsistency tend to conclude, is simpler than any of these defenses. Marge did not have a fear of flying in the 3rd season because the writers had not thought of giving her one yet. The phobia was invented for the 6th season episode as a premise that could generate a character-focused story about Marge's psychology and her relationship with her father. The premise was good enough to produce a genuinely strong episode. The problem is that by the time the writers thought of it, the show had already accumulated seasons of episodes in which Marge had traveled on planes without without difficulty, and the new premise did not reconcile itself with those earlier episodes because the writers were not, as a primary concern, in the business of reconciling. They were in the business of making a good episode, and they made one. The specific emotional material at the heart of the episode is worth dwelling on, because it is genuinely rich. Marge's discovery that her father was not a pilot but a male flight attendant is the revealed source of the phobia, but the episode treats this with considerable sophistication. The shame Marge felt as a child was not really about airplanes. It was about the collapse of an image she had constructed of her father, the image of a pilot as a figure of competence and authority and adventure, an image that her father himself had allowed her to maintain. When that image collapsed, it collapsed into something that felt like loss, even though her father was still there, still the same person, still flying the same routes. The fear of flying is not really a fear of flying. It is a fear of the gap between what a person believes and what turns out to be true, dressed up in the specific clothing of airplane anxiety. That is a genuinely interesting piece of psychological writing, the kind of thing that the show at its best was capable of. Anne Bancroft's Dr. Zweig pushes gently at Marge's defenses with a combination of clinical precision and dry humor that makes the therapy scenes feel real rather than perfunctory. The episode earned its emotional moments, but earning emotional moments within a single episode is different from earning them across the whole of the series, and across the whole of the series, the fear of flying has an uncertain status. It appears in the 6th season, is addressed in the 6th season, and then floats in and out of subsequent episodes with no consistency. The family continues to travel. Marge continues, in most episodes, to board planes without visible distress. On occasions when the phobia is relevant to a story, it tends to resurface. On occasions when it is not relevant, it tends to disappear. This is the elastic canon in operation again. The same principle that governs Homer's age and Springfield's geography, applied now to a character's deep psychological wound. The wound is there when the story needs it. It is not there when the story does not. There is a broader pattern here that the flying episode illustrates particularly clearly, which is the way the show invented character traits retroactively to serve individual stories and then struggled to maintain those traits consistently over time. Marge's flying phobia is one example. Bart's allergies are another case, addressed more fully elsewhere in this walk, where the show invents a specific allergy for Bart in a later season, despite having shown him eating the offending food without consequence in earlier seasons. These are not cases of a character developing over time in ways that produce new information. They are cases of a writer needing a particular trait to exist for a particular episode and inserting it without checking whether the existing record of the character supports its presence. What the fear of flying case reveals specifically is how the show handled the space between Marge's public face and her private interior. Marge is, by design, the most composed member of the family. She is the one who manages, who organizes, who absorbs the chaos that Homer and the children generate and converts it into something livable. Her composure is both a character trait and a narrative function. And the 6th season, which was in many ways a high point of the show's creative ambition, was genuinely interested in the question of what exists underneath that composure. The Year's Marge episodes were willing to look at what she suppressed, and what it cost her to suppress it. Fear of flying is part of that interest. So is an episode about her gambling addiction that aired the same season. These episodes are good because they take the character seriously as a person with an interior life that her exterior presentation does not fully reveal. The tragedy of the flying phobia, from a continuity perspective, is that it was good enough to deserve better treatment. A fear that well-sourced in real psychology attached to a moment of childhood disillusionment that's specific and that emotionally true deserved to be a consistent part of the character going forward. If the show had committed to it, if subsequent episodes had found ways to acknowledge it and work around it and occasionally revisit it, it would have added texture to Marge that would have served her characterization across many seasons. Instead, it became one more floating element, present when useful and absent when inconvenient, which is exactly the fate that all the most interesting specific details of the show's characters eventually meet when the pressure of continued production outweighs the patience required to maintain them. Marge flew to Washington before she was afraid of flying. She flew to Australia after she had been afraid. She flew to Japan and Brazil and various other international destinations in episodes that followed the 6th season without the phobia producing any noticeable turbulence. The woman who sat in that plane seat and trembled and demanded to be let off before takeoff. The woman who lay on a therapist's couch and traced her fear back to a father who turned out to be something other than what she had believed is the same woman who then boarded flight after flight in the years that followed without incident, because the show needed her to go where the story was going, and the story was not going to the therapist's office. office. She was never afraid, and then she was, and then she mostly was not again. The fear existed in the space the show gave it, and no further, which may be the most honest thing that can be said about it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Marge's fear of flying appeared fully formed in the 6th season, was handled with genuine care and psychological depth, and then mostly evaporated across the episodes that followed, because the show needed her on planes and the phobia was inconvenient. Next, the walk moves to a logic failure that predates even the earliest episodes, one that was visible from the very first weeks of the series, and that the show's own creator has explained in 2 different ways depending on who was asking. Section 6. The man behind the curtain. Before the show had found its rhythm, before the animation had settled into the clean and consistent style that most people associate with it, before the voices had fully become the voices, and the characters had fully become themselves, there was a single episode that contained one of the most visually jarring moments in the show's entire run. The episode was the 3rd of the 1st season, titled Homer's Odyssey, and it aired in January of 1990. The show was less than 2 months old. The audience was still learning who everyone was, still absorbing the world of Springfield and its inhabitants, still adjusting to the novelty of a primetime animated sitcom that took its characters seriously enough to give them real problems. And in that episode, during a scene set at the Springfield nuclear power plant, a character appeared on screen who looked nothing like what he would eventually become. The character was Waylon Smithers, Mr. Burns' personal assistant, a man who would go on to become one of the most distinctive and beloved supporting figures in the show's long history. In the scene, Smithers is giving a tour of the nuclear plant. He is clearly recognizable as Smithers in terms of his role and his manner, but his appearance is entirely different from what it would become in every subsequent episode. His skin is dark, his hair is a deep blue. The Smithers that millions of viewers would come to know across 35 years of episodes is a pale yellow figure with gray hair, the same yellow as almost every other character in Springfield, rendered in the warm amber that the show's animators established as the standard human skin tone for the world they were building. The Smithers in Homer's Odyssey is not that figure. He is a different visual entity, one that appears in exactly 1 episode before the correction is made, never to appear again in that form. The question of why this happened has 2 answers, and both answers are true, and the fact that both answers are true simultaneously makes the story more interesting than either answer alone would be. The first answer comes from Matt Groening himself. In an interview with the celebrity news outlet TMZ, Groening was asked directly about the discrepancy. His explanation was brief and practical. Smithers, he said, was always intended to be yellow. The color stylist who worked on that early episode, a woman named Georgie Peluche, made an error. She painted the character darker than the design called for. The production was new, the processes were not yet fully established, and at that early stage of the show's life, the budget was tight enough that fixing animation errors after the fact was not always possible. The production team simply did not have the money to redo the scene. So the error aired. It appeared on network television in front of millions of viewers, and then the next episode corrected it, and Smithers became the pale yellow figure he has remained ever since. Groening's account is that it was an accident, a budget-constrained mistake, and nothing more. The second answer comes from the show's production history and from the executives and writers who were involved in the early development of the characters. Executive producer Jay Kogan offered a different angle on the story, explaining that there had been internal discussion in the early development of Smithers about making the character both gay and black. In Kogan's account, the idea was considered and then set aside, with the decision being made that combining those 2 elements in a single character who was also the servile assistant to a wealthy and powerful white man would send a message the producers were not comfortable sending. The phrase that has been reported in connection with this decision is that it would be a bad idea to have a black subservient character to a rich white man. The concern was about the image that combination would project, the visual echo of a historical dynamic that the show had no desire to invoke. And so the concept was adjusted. Smithers remained gay, a quality the show would develop slowly and carefully across many seasons, but his appearance was changed to match the standard yellow of the Springfield population. These 2 accounts are not necessarily contradictory. Both can be true at once. An early concept can involve a black character, a decision can be made to change that concept for reasons of sensitivity, and the change can still be imperfectly executed in the first episode due to a coloring error that the budget did not allow to be corrected. The accident and the decision can coexist. What the 2 accounts together produce is a picture of a show that was still figuring itself out, still making choices about who its characters were and what they would look like, and what the show would and would not do, and making some of those choices under pressure of time and money, and the inherent chaos of a new production finding its footing. Groening's own account to TMZ is particularly worth sitting with for a moment, because it contains a detail that says something about the conditions under which the early show was made. He noted specifically that at the time, the production did not have enough money to do retakes. When glitches and mistakes happened, they stayed that way. This was not a well-funded operation in its earliest weeks. The show that would eventually become one of the most profitable franchises in the history of American entertainment began its life with margins tight enough that a coloring error on a single character in a single episode could not be fixed before airing. The error went out because going out was cheaper than going back. What makes this particular logic failure different from many of the others scattered across the show's history is that it is the most visible. Almost every other inconsistency discussed in this walk requires some degree of cross-referencing to notice. The floating timeline of Homer and Marge's courtship requires knowing both The Way We Was and That 90s Show. The shifting geography of Springfield requires watching many episodes and keeping mental notes about where things are. Marge's fear of flying requires knowing both the third season trip to Washington and the sixth season therapy sessions. But the Smithers color discrepancy is immediately visible to anyone who watches Homer's Odyssey without any additional context. The character simply looks wrong, conspicuously wrong, in a way that stands out even to a viewer who has never seen another episode of the show. The error is self-announcing. This visibility made it a topic of fan discussion for decades before the streaming era made every episode easily accessible for comparison. There were viewers who remembered seeing that early Smithers and wondered what they had seen. There were debates about what it meant. When Disney Plus launched and made all seasons of the show available for streaming, a new wave of viewers encountered the discrepancy fresh and brought it to social media with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. The show's creators found themselves answering the question again decades after the episode had aired, because the availability of the archive had made the error newly visible to people who had never had occasion to watch the first season's third episode in careful detail before. The broader context of the show's early animation problems is worth establishing here, because the Smithers coloring is the most prominent, but not the only visual inconsistency from those first episodes. The production records and fan archives that have documented the early seasons reveal a range of similar errors scattered across the initial run. In the very first episode, Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, which was the Christmas special that launched the series, background characters were rendered with inconsistent colors, with the skin tones of minor figures shifting from shot to shot in ways that reflected the rushed conditions of early production. In a third season episode called Stark Raving Dad, which is the episode featuring the voice of Michael Jackson as a large white man who believes he is Michael Jackson, the character of groundskeeper Willie is accidentally rendered with dark skin in a crowd scene on the lawn outside the Simpson home. Willie is a pale Scottish character in every other episode he appears in. The dark rendering in that single shot is another error of the same class as the Smithers coloring, a background character briefly taking on an incorrect appearance because someone in the production chain applied the wrong color to the wrong figure. Milhouse, Bart's best friend, appeared with black hair rather than his established blue-gray in some of the earliest episodes, a variation that corrected itself as the production settled into consistency. Chief Wiggum, the police chief, has blue hair as his established visual identity, but in a number of early episodes and in various night scenes throughout the show's run, his hair appears black, either through the same class of coloring error that affected Smithers and Milhouse, or through a deliberate but inconsistent choice to render blue hair as black in low-light conditions. The principal's school building, as noted elsewhere, changed color multiple times in the early seasons. These accumulated visual inconsistencies paint a picture of a production that was, in its earliest phase, operating faster than it could maintain full quality control, relying on overseas animation studios and communication chains that introduced errors at multiple points between the American writers and the finished frames that aired on television. The overseas animation aspect is important context. From its earliest episodes, The Simpsons sent its scripts and storyboards to animation studios in South Korea for the actual drawing and coloring work. This was standard practice in American television animation at the time, a cost-saving measure that allowed productions to spend more of their budget on writing and voice work while reducing the per-frame cost of the animation itself. The arrangement worked well enough to produce the show's signature look across many years, but in the earliest episodes, before the communication between the American production staff and the Korean animators had been fully refined, and before detailed style guides had been established and distributed, errors crept through. The Smithers coloring was almost certainly the product of this system, a color specification that was imprecise or misread, or simply not yet established with enough clarity to prevent the mistake. mistake. What the Smithers case ultimately illustrates, beyond the specific question of one character's skin color in one episode, is how the visual language of the show was not a finished product when it went on air, but something that was assembled and refined in real time in front of a live audience while the episodes were still being made and transmitted. The show that exists now, with its consistent visual style and its carefully maintained character designs, is the result of decades of accumulated refinement. The show that aired in January of 1990 was a rougher and less certain version of that eventual product, still working out what it was going to look like and who its characters were going to be, and the errors that resulted from that uncertainty are visible in the archive for anyone who goes looking. Smithers himself, in every episode after the third, was exactly who he was always meant to be. The yellow skin, the gray hair, the devotion to Mr. Burns that the show developed across many seasons with considerable wit and genuine care. The character that one color error briefly obscured was a fully realized creation from the beginning. It just took one episode for the production to successfully render him that way, and the episode in which it failed to do so remains in the archive, available to anyone with a streaming subscription. A small and specific and entirely human mistake preserved in amber, while everything around it slowly became more perfect. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Smithers appeared in the wrong color in the show's third episode because the budget was too tight to fix it, and the discrepancy has been visible to careful viewers ever since. Next, the walk turns to the single greatest ongoing logic failure in the show's entire history. A man who has held nearly 300 jobs across 35 years of television and somehow always ends up back in the same chair at the same nuclear power plant, as if nothing in between ever happened at all. Section 7. The jobs that never ended. Consider the arithmetic for a moment. The Simpsons has been on television for more than 35 years. Homer Simpson has, across those years, held somewhere in the region of 275 different jobs, depending on which sources are counted and how broadly the definition of a job is applied. Matt Groening himself has stated that across the first 400 episodes alone, Homer held 188 distinct positions. That number has grown considerably in the seasons since. He has been a boxer, an astronaut, a food critic, a snowplow operator, a monorail conductor, a beer baron, a country western manager, a bodyguard, a farmer, a missionary, a carny, a garbage commissioner, a grease salesman, a conceptual artist, a fortune cookie writer, a mayor, and a police chief. He has worked in 2 branches of the American military. He has been, at various points, a criminal, an informant for the federal government, and a Grammy Award winner. He has been the chief executive officer of the Springfield nuclear power plant, which is also the facility he regularly fails to adequately supervise as a lowly safety inspector in Sector 7G. And through all of it, episode after episode, season after season, he has always ended up back in that chair. The chair in Sector 7G is the fixed point around which all the other employment chaos orbits. Homer gets fired, or quits, or is lured away by some improbable opportunity, and he spends the episode pursuing whatever the new thing is with his characteristic combination of enthusiasm and incompetence, and then by the time the credits roll, he is back where he started. The plant receives him again. Mr. Burns, who cannot reliably remember Homer's name and whose opinion of Homer ranges from contemptuous indifference to active hostility, always ends up employing him again. This has happened so many times across so many seasons that the audience long ago stopped expecting the new job to stick. The safety inspector position is not a job Homer holds. It is a condition he exists in, briefly interrupted by adventures and just as briefly restored. The logic failure embedded in this pattern is not subtle. A man cannot hold 275 jobs across a working life of what the show suggests is roughly 15 to 20 years of adult employment without the mathematics becoming absurd. Some of the positions Homer has held have been brief, lasting only an episode or an afternoon within the story, but others have been presented as genuine career shifts, situations where Homer has genuinely left the plant and genuinely built something new, only for the reset to arrive regardless of how permanent the departure seemed. He has been fired from the plant for reasons ranging from gross negligence to deliberate sabotage to simply failing to show up so many times that the firing should have become permanent long before the 10th occasion, let alone the 242nd. The show itself was aware of this as a recurring joke very early in its run. One of the things that made the first several seasons so sharp was that the writers treated Homer's professional failures as meaningful consequences within individual episodes. When Homer was fired in the first season's third episode, the Homer's Odyssey episode where the Smithers coloring error also occurred, the firing produced real distress. Homer spiraled. He considered ending things. He eventually channeled his despair into public advocacy for safety improvements in Springfield, which so embarrassed Mr. Burns that Burns offered him a new position as nuclear safety inspector simply to get him to stop protesting. This is, if taken seriously, a deeply strange reason to hire someone. Burns is creating a safety inspector position specifically to silence a critic, not because he wants his plant to be safe. The person in that position is the man who just demonstrated his unreliability by crashing a cart into a cooling vent. The logic of the hire does not hold up even before Homer has held the job for a single day, but the first season played it straight enough that the absurdity read as character comedy rather than structural failure. Homer was desperate. Burns was calculating. The arrangement made a kind of cynical sense within the terms the show was establishing. The problem accumulated across the following 3 decades, as Homer was fired and rehired so many times that the arrangement lost whatever cynical sense it had originally possessed and became simply a convention, a feature of the show's format that everyone accepted without examining. The 36th season addressed this directly, and the address it offered was one of the more creative pieces of retroactive continuity the show has produced in its later years. An episode revealed that Homer's guaranteed employment at the plant was not the result of Burns's indifference or institutional inertia, but of a specific deal made decades earlier between Mr. Burns and Grandpa Simpson. The backstory constructed for this episode placed Grandpa as a private investigator in the 1980s, investigating Burns for reasons that the episode leaves somewhat murky but implies are criminal in nature. During this investigation, Grandpa's partner disappeared under circumstances suggesting Burns was involved. Burns, confronted by this situation, offered Grandpa a deal. In exchange for Grandpa dropping the investigation and keeping quiet about what he had found, Burns would guarantee Homer a job at the nuclear power plant for life. No matter how badly Homer performed, no matter how many times he was technically fired, the job would always be there when he came back. Burns has kept this deal across the entire run of the show, through every firing and every rehiring, apparently tracking his end of the bargain even as he consistently fails to track Homer's name. The episode is charming in the way that good retroactive continuity can be charming. It does not change what came before. It adds a layer underneath it that makes the existing pattern feel less arbitrary. The 275 jobs and the 275 returns to Sector 7G are not the result of the show failing to follow through on its own story logic. They are the result of a deal made in the 1980s between an old man who loved his son and a powerful man who needed to protect himself from scrutiny. Homer has been employed this whole time not by Mr. Burns's forgetfulness, but by Burns's memory, specifically his memory of an obligation that predates anything the audience has witnessed in the show. Whether this retroactive explanation fully resolves the logic failure is a matter of how generously one is inclined to read it. The deal explains why Homer always gets his job back. It does not fully explain how the job can absorb someone who has been a police chief, a mayor, a country western manager, a monorail conductor, and a Grammy winner in between stints as a nuclear safety inspector, without any of those experiences appearing to affect his standing at the plant in any lasting way. The deal covers the employment. The rest of the peculiarity, the sheer volume of parallel careers, the speed of the cycling, the way each new job leaves no trace on the subsequent return, that remains a function of the show's format rather than any in-universe explanation. Homer's position as safety inspector is itself, independent of all the job cycling, one of the show's more durable jokes about competence and institutional dysfunction. The title of safety inspector implies a responsibility for ensuring that the nuclear plant operates without endangering the people who work there or the surrounding community. Homer's actual approach to this responsibility has, across the show's run, involved sleeping at his workstation, ignoring warning lights, losing vital components, and on at least one memorable occasion preventing a nuclear meltdown through a combination of blind luck and a completely wrong guess that happened to produce the right outcome. An episode called Homer Defined from the 2nd season centers on exactly this scenario. Homer saves Springfield from a meltdown by randomly pressing buttons on a console he does not understand, is credited as a hero, and receives professional recognition that bears no relationship to the actual quality of his work. The episode treats this as comedy. It also functions, quietly, as a description of how Homer has always operated and will always operate, rewarded by outcomes that his actions do not deserve, and protected by institutional forces that he does not understand. The list of Homer's jobs, when read in full, has a cumulative effect that goes beyond comedy into something stranger. Boxer, food critic, conceptual artist, fortune cookie writer, beer baron, missionary. These are not simply a random selection of possible occupations. situations. They trace the shape of a mind that finds itself genuinely, immediately enthusiastic about almost any new situation it encounters, commits completely and without reservation, discovers the limits of its own capabilities at approximately the same speed in every case, and then retreats back to the familiar. Homer does not have a career. He has a personality that keeps encountering the world and being returned to its starting position by the encounter. The jobs are a record of that personality in motion. The fact that none of them stick is not a failure of the show's logic so much as the clearest possible expression of who Homer is as a person. There is one job that is worth examining separately because it reveals the reset mechanism in its most concentrated form. In an episode called And Maggie Makes Three, from the 5th season, the story is told in flashback and concerns the period immediately before Maggie was born. Homer, facing financial pressure from Marge's first 2 pregnancies, had worked his way out of the nuclear plant and into what the episode presents as his dream job, working at a bowling alley. The bowling alley scenes are rendered with a warmth and specificity that the show reserves for things it takes seriously. Homer in that job is genuinely happy, genuinely at home, in a way that the nuclear plant never makes him. When Marge becomes pregnant with Maggie, Homer returns to the plant and asks Burns for his job back. Burns, who has plastered the office with photographs of Homer's face accompanied by the words "do not rehire" under each one, agrees to take him back anyway, and to underline the humiliation, places a sign above Homer's workstation reading, "Don't forget, you're here forever." Homer's response is to rearrange the letters of that sign into "Do it for her," surrounding it with photographs of Maggie. The moment is one of the most genuinely moving things the show has ever produced, but the episode also illustrates the reset in its starkest form. Homer had a dream. The dream was specific and real and emotionally credible. He left it behind for the family, which is a real sacrifice, and then he was returned to Sector 7G, which is where the show needs him to be. The reset was dressed in its most moving available clothing, and it still happened. The chair was still there at the end. It is always there at the end. The broader logic failure of the jobs is ultimately inseparable from what the show is. A show about a man who is always approximately the same person, living in a town that is always approximately the same place, in a family that never ages and never fully changes, cannot allow its central character to genuinely become something new and remain in that new state. The reset is not a mistake. It is the operating system. But the operating system, applied across 275 jobs over 35 years, produces a record that defies any ordinary understanding of how employment, ambition, consequence, or the passage of time actually work. Homer has had every job. Homer is always the safety inspector. Both of these things are true, and neither one makes the other make sense. And the show has been running on that particular impossibility for longer than most of its viewers have been alive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Homer has held nearly 300 jobs and always returned to the same chair at the same plant, protected by a deal made before most of the audience ever met him. Next, the walk expands beyond Homer to look at the rules the show set for its entire world and then quietly forgot, the bans that were never enforced, the deaths that were never permanent, and the allergies that came and went depending entirely on what the episode needed that week. Section 8. The rules nobody followed. Every long-running fictional world accumulates rules. Some rules are stated explicitly, announced in dialogue, or demonstrated through consequence, and some rules are implied, emerging from the patterns of how the story behaves over time. Either way, rules do something important for a fictional world. They create the sense that events have weight, that choices produce consequences, that what happens in one episode does not simply evaporate when the credits roll. Rules are what separate a world from a series of disconnected sketches. They are what make a place feel like a place rather than a backdrop that reshuffles itself between stories. The Simpsons has stated many rules across its long run. The family has been banned from states. Characters have died. Relationships have been formally ended. Allergies have been established as medically serious. Legal orders have been handed down by fictional judges in fictional courtrooms with all the weight that a fictional court can bring to bear. And then, with a consistency that is itself almost a rule, those rules have been quietly set aside whenever the next episode needed to put the characters somewhere the rules said they could not go, or bring back someone the show had already removed, or have Bart eat something he was supposed to be severely allergic to. The world of Springfield is not a world without consequences. It is a world where consequences last exactly as long as the episode that produces them, and then dissolve so completely that by the following week they might never have existed at all. The banned states are perhaps the clearest illustration of this pattern, because they are stated with such specificity and such finality that their subsequent frequent disregard becomes impossible to overlook. In an 11th season episode called Kill the Alligator and Run, the Simpson family travels to Florida for a spring break vacation that goes badly in a series of escalating ways, culminating in Homer apparently killing a beloved local alligator named Captain Jack. The family is subsequently banned by a Florida judge from ever entering the state of Florida again. The episode ends with Marge drawing an X through Florida on a map of the United States, and the camera pulls back to reveal that the map already has X's through most of the other states. Only North Dakota and Arizona remain unmarked. Marge draws a line through Arizona as well after Homer complains about the smell, leaving North Dakota as the sole American state where the Simpsons are legally welcome. The joke is enormous and absurd and genuinely funny. It is also, technically, a statement about the character's legal status that should carry consequences for every subsequent episode involving domestic travel. The consequences never arrive. The family visits Florida again in subsequent seasons, traveling to Epcot Center in a 14th season episode called Special Edna, and to Miami in a 15th season episode called Catch 'em If You Can. Neither visit produces any reference to the legal ban. The judge's order, the X's on the map, the running joke about North Dakota, none of it is acknowledged. The Simpsons are simply in Florida, doing Florida things, as if the ban was a dream that everyone in Springfield had simultaneously and then forgot by morning. Las Vegas carries a similar problem. In a 10th season episode called Viva Ned Flanders, Homer and Ned travel to Las Vegas, become intoxicated, and each wake up married to a woman they do not know. The situation produces chaos, and the resolution involves Homer and Ned fleeing the city. The episode ends with them being permanently banned from Las Vegas, thrown out of the territory with enough ceremony that the ban registers as a meaningful plot development rather than a throwaway gag. In subsequent seasons, Las Vegas reappears as a setting with Homer present in it, sometimes as a significant location and sometimes as a passing reference, without any acknowledgement that he was permanently expelled from the city. The ban dissolved between episodes with no explanation and no fanfare. The pattern holds for the court order at the end of When You Dish Upon a Star, the season 10 episode in which Homer becomes entangled with the celebrity couple of Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger. The episode concludes with Homer being legally ordered to stay 500 miles away from any celebrity, dead or alive, for the rest of his life. This order, if followed, would have prevented the show from producing another celebrity cameo episode ever again, since Homer is almost always present during celebrity encounters. The order was ignored from the following season onward. The show continued producing celebrity cameos at its established pace, with Homer at the center of them, and nobody in the writer's room apparently felt the need to reference or resolve the judicial restriction that an earlier episode had imposed on the character. The court order existed for the duration of the episode that contained it, and not a moment longer. Character deaths occupy an even more complicated position in the show's relationship with its own rules, because death is the most irreversible thing that can happen within a story, and the show has treated it with varying degrees of seriousness, depending on the character involved and the season in which the death occurred. Some deaths have been permanent and have been treated with real weight. The death of Maud Flanders in a season 11 episode called Alone Again Natura Diddly was the result of an off-screen contractual dispute between the show's producers and the actress who voiced the character, Maggie Roswell, and it was handled with genuine seriousness. Ned Flanders lost his wife in an episode that did not play the death for easy comedy, and the impact of that loss was woven into Ned's characterization across subsequent seasons. Maud has not come back. Her death has remained a fixed point in the show's continuity in a way that very few fixed points have, but other deaths have been considerably less permanent. Dr. Marvin Monroe is one of the more instructive examples. Monroe was a recurring character in the early seasons, a therapist who appeared in several episodes and who was referenced in a season 7 episode as having died, with a trivia question during the show's 138th episode spectacular using his death as a piece of Simpsons history. A season 11 episode showed his gravestone. The character was gone, confirmed dead by the show's own internal documentation. Then a season 15 episode brought him back, alive, explaining through Monroe himself that he had simply been very ill for an extended period. The show later acknowledged this resurrection with a joke suggesting Monroe had written a book about his experience, which is the series turning its own continuity failure into a self-referential gag rather than resolving it. Monroe's death was real until it became inconvenient, at which point it became an extended illness, and the show made a joke about the implausibility of that revision without actually addressing the underlying problem. Hans Moleman, the ancient and unfortunate recurring figure who is Springfield's most reliable victim, has died died or appeared to die in so many episodes that his survival has become its own running joke. He has been run over, buried alive, set on fire, mauled, and subjected to a variety of other fatal-seeming events across the show's history. The joke is that he always comes back, and the show has never offered a serious explanation for his continued existence. Sources that have examined his appearances have noted that his stated age has also shifted dramatically across episodes, with him appearing to be in his 80s in some contexts and his 30s in others, which produces the entertaining but logically incoherent image of a man who is simultaneously ancient and middle-aged, and somehow also immortal. Bleeding Gums Murphy, the jazz musician who was Lisa's mentor and friend, died in a fifth-season episode called Round Springfield, and his death was handled with real emotional care. Lisa grieved. The episode used his passing to explore something genuine about loss, and about the way that music can carry the presence of someone who is no longer there. The death felt permanent and meaningful. Then the Simpsons movie, released in 2007, included Bleeding Gums Murphy in a crowd scene, visible among the residents of Springfield despite having died 12 years of broadcast time earlier. His appearance was brief enough that it could potentially be dismissed as a background error, but it is there, in the finished film, visible to anyone who looks. The allergy question adds another dimension to this collection of ignored rules. The show has established various allergies for various characters across its run, and the relationship between those established allergies and subsequent episodes in which the characters encounter the substances they are supposedly allergic to has been, to put it generously, inconsistent. Bart's shrimp allergy, which became a central plot point in an 18th season episode called Please Homer Don't Hammer 'Em, required the audience to accept that Bart had always been severely allergic to shrimp. The allergy is presented as medically documented, serious enough that Skinner is able to weaponize it after breaking into a hospital to steal Bart's medical records. The episode builds an entire subplot around the mutual terror that Bart and Skinner can now impose on each other by wielding their respective allergens, which is genuinely funny as a premise. The problem is that Bart had eaten shrimp in earlier episodes without any adverse reaction. He had mentioned eating them specifically in a 13th season episode, an allergy severe enough to be weaponized by a principal who has to obtain the information by breaking into a hospital is not the kind of condition that goes unnoticed across years of casual shrimp consumption. Bart's allergy to butterscotch adds another layer. An early season episode has Marge mention that Bart is allergic to butterscotch, a detail that is introduced as established fact and then never maintained. Butterscotch chicken is subsequently described as his favorite food in later contexts, which creates the image of a child enthusiastically eating his way through a dish made primarily from the substance that his own mother identified as medically dangerous to him. The show did not track this. Nobody went back and checked. The detail was introduced, it served its purpose in the episode that needed it, and then it sat in the archive, contradicting everything that came after it, waiting for someone to notice. Apu's dietary restrictions offer a related case. In a 7th season episode called Lisa the Vegetarian, Apu describes himself as vegan, explicitly stating that he does not eat anything that comes from an animal. The detail is consistent with the character's Hindu faith and is presented as a genuine aspect of who he is, rather than a throwaway joke. But in a subsequent episode, Apu is seen at a party picking up a hot dog from a grill and eating it. The show's defenders have offered various readings of this moment, suggesting the hot dog might have been a tofu substitute, or that Apu might have been picking it up on behalf of someone else, but the image as presented is simply a man eating a hot dog, which is made from an animal, which is a thing he said he does not do. The defense requires more interpretive generosity than the scene itself invites. Milhouse's lactose intolerance, which is established in an episode that mentions his dairy allergy as a genuine medical condition, produces similar problems when Milhouse is subsequently shown eating dairy products in other episodes without apparent distress. The show seems to introduce food intolerances and allergies as needed for particular stories, and then release them back into the general population of forgotten details when the story that needed them is finished. Smithers has stated that a bee sting could potentially kill him. This information is treated in the episode that contains it as serious medical information, the kind of thing a person says when they want others to understand that their allergy is genuinely life-threatening rather than merely unpleasant. In a later episode, Smithers approaches beehives without apparent fear and even casually notes that some of the bees are stinging him, which is a description of exactly the kind of event that a fatal bee sting allergy should make terrifying rather than incidental. The potentially fatal allergy had been forgotten between episodes, and nobody flagged the inconsistency before the new scene aired. What unites all of these ignored rules rules, across bans and deaths and allergies and court orders, is a single underlying reality about how the show was actually made. Each episode was written primarily as its own unit. The writers working on a given episode were trying to make that episode good, and making that episode good meant using whatever character details, whatever premises, whatever consequences were most useful for the story they were telling right now. The show did not have a dedicated continuity editor in the way that a long-running novel series might have someone whose specific job is to ensure that what happens in Book 12 does not contradict what was established in Book 3. Individual writers checked their own work. The script department maintained records of what had aired, but the sheer volume of material, hundreds of episodes across dozens of seasons, made comprehensive continuity tracking genuinely difficult, and the show's fundamental format, the comedic reset, worked against the maintenance of consequences even when the writers were trying to maintain them. The result is a world that feels complete and real and internally consistent in any given episode, and feels like a collection of beautiful contradictions when viewed across its entire span. Springfield is a place where dying is usually temporary, where bans are advisory rather than binding, where allergies are situational, and where the legal rulings of fictional judges evaporate between seasons. The rules of this world are the rules of comedy rather than the rules of consequence. They hold until the next joke needs them to not hold, and then they release, and the next joke arrives, and the show continues, and the audience follows it, because the jokes are good enough to make the rules feel less important than they would be in a world that took itself more seriously. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The rules of Springfield are made to be forgotten, the bans unobserved, the deaths undone, the allergies applied selectively and released when no longer useful. Next, the walk moves to the grandest and most ambitious logic failure in the show's history, the episode that confidently mapped out the entire future of the Simpson family, and then watched that future be quietly contradicted, one flash-forward episode at a time, across the decades that followed. Section 9. The future that kept changing. There is something genuinely ambitious about a television show deciding to show its audience the future. Most long-running series avoid it, and the reason they avoid it is obvious once the risk is named. A show that depicts the future of its characters is making commitments. It is telling the audience what will happen, who these people will become, where the paths they are currently walking will eventually lead. Those commitments can feel exciting in the moment of the depiction, and they carry real emotional weight when done well, but they also create a record. A fixed record of what the future is supposed to contain, and any subsequent episode that contradicts that record does not simply introduce a new inconsistency, it retroactively unmakes something the audience was invited to care about, to believe in, to hold as a piece of knowledge about people they had spent years watching. The Simpsons made this commitment in March of 1995, in the 19th episode of the 6th season, and it made it with more care and craft than any flash-forward episode it would produce afterward. The episode is called Lisa's Wedding. Its premise is delivered through a fortune-telling booth at a Renaissance fair, where Lisa sits across from a woman who claims to be able to show her the story of her first true love. The story takes place in the year 2010, 15 years in the future from the episode's broadcast date. Lisa is 23 years old. She is a university student in England, and she meets a fellow student named Hugh Parkfield, and the two of them fall into the kind of love that the show at its best could depict with remarkable gentleness and precision. Mandy Patinkin voiced Hugh, and the performance is one of the finest guest contributions in the show's history. The episode won an Emmy Award. It is regularly cited by critics and fans as one of the greatest episodes the show ever produced. What made Lisa's Wedding work as a piece of storytelling, beyond the quality of the romance at its center, was the care with which it constructed the Springfield of 2010. Every major character was redesigned to show the passage of 15 years. Homer was heavier, with an additional line under each eye and one fewer hair on his head. Marge's blue hair had lightened. Bart had a beard. Maggie was a teenager who, in a running joke carried across the entire episode, was perpetually about to say something before being interrupted, the implication being that the baby who never spoke had grown up into someone who never stopped speaking. The background details of the future Springfield were full of jokes that the writers had thought carefully about. The Rolling Stones were still touring, now on their steel wheelchair tour. Fox had become a hardcore adult content channel so gradually that nobody had noticed. Several American television networks had merged into a single entity. A newscast listed a series of arrested celebrities whose names combined present-day fame with future extrapolation in ways that were funny, precisely because they required the viewer to project forward from 1995. The episode also made a genuine prediction that came true within the show itself before it came true in the real world. Lisa in 2010 again is a vegetarian. At the time the episode aired, Lisa was not yet a vegetarian in the present-day continuity of the show. The vegetarianism had not been established. But the episode showed her that way in the future, and then a 7th season episode called Lisa the Vegetarian followed, making the future detail retroactively accurate as a piece of foreshadowing. This is the show's flash-forward mechanism at its most elegant, planting something in the future that the present-day episodes then caught up to, creating the sensation of a story that knows where it is going. Beyond the show's internal continuity, the episode's predictions about the real 2010 have been examined extensively by people who enjoy that kind of accounting. Some of them landed with surprising accuracy. Smartwatch technology of the kind the episode depicted was not yet commercially available in 1995, but became mainstream in the years following 2010. Video calling, shown as a routine form of communication between Hugh and his parents, was not yet the casual everyday technology it would become. A reading device shown in Lisa's university room resembled the kind of electronic reader that companies would eventually produce. The Rolling Stones did continue touring well past 2010. None of these hits were perfect matches, but they were close enough that the episode earned a reputation as a piece of accidental prophecy alongside the show's other famous predictive moments. But the 2010 that the episode depicted was not only a set of technological and cultural predictions, it was a specific account of what the Simpson family's lives would look like 15 years forward. Homer was still in Sector 7G at the nuclear plant. Milhouse had become Homer's supervisor, which was a joke about their respective capabilities dressed up as a piece of future biography. Bart was twice divorced and working in building demolition while maintaining vague plans to attend law school. Maggie had become a prolific talker, and Lisa was in England, in love, on the verge of marrying someone who ultimately proved unable to accept her family as the price of having her. The wedding was called off. Lisa chose her father over her fiancé. In a scene between Homer and Lisa that the episode handles with real emotional delicacy, and the future that had been shown was the future of a woman who had not yet found the person she would end up with. The problem began accumulating with the next flash-forward episode the show produced, a season 11 entry called Bart to the Future. This episode used a different framing device, a vision of the future shown to Bart by a Native American casino owner, and it placed the story approximately 3 decades after the present, in a future where Bart is a failing musician and Lisa has become the first straight female president of the United States. The two futures are not compatible in any obvious way. Lisa's wedding showed her as a university student in England in 2010. Bart to the Future showed her as a sitting president sometime in the 2030s, which requires her to have had a career arc between those 2 points that neither episode depicts or accounts for. The futures are simply different futures, drawn from different premises for different creative purposes, without any apparent effort to make them cohere. The contradiction deepens further when subsequent flash-forward episodes are considered. A season 16 episode called Future Drama placed the story approximately 10 years ahead of its broadcast date, showing Bart and Lisa as high school seniors rather than as the adults they were supposed to be in Lisa's wedding's 2010. If both episodes are taken as accurate depictions of the future, then Lisa at the same approximate age is simultaneously finishing high school and getting married in England, which is possible only if she compressed her entire adolescence into a very short period and enrolled in a British university immediately afterward, which the episodes do not suggest and which the general timeline does not support. A season 23rd episode called Holidays of Future Past, which many critics have described as among the best of the show's later flash-forward episodes, placed the story 30 years ahead and showed Lisa as a divorced mother with a complicated relationship with her own daughter, which requires her to have been married and had a child in the intervening period, a marriage and child that are not the marriage and child depicted in Lisa's wedding. The man she married in Holidays of Future Past is Milhouse, which is a resolution to a long-running thread of the show about Milhouse's unrequited love for Lisa, but it is a different resolution than the one Lisa's wedding offered. Lisa's wedding showed her almost marrying a British academic named Hugh before choosing her family. Holidays of Future Past showed her having married and divorced Milhouse. The two futures are not versions of the same story. They are entirely separate stories that happen to share a character. By the time a season 29th episode called Mr. Lisa's Opus arrived, the contradictions had accumulated into a genuinely complex tangle. That episode depicted Lisa as a baby in 2010, in direct contradiction to Lisa's wedding, which had shown her as a 23-year-old university student in the same year. If both episodes are set in a real 2010, one of them is wrong about the most basic biographical fact of when the character was born. The show had produced flash-forward episodes across 20 years that depicted the same character character at vastly different life stages in the same year, with no acknowledgement of the contradiction and no attempt at resolution. What the show's creative leadership has said about this, when asked directly, is consistent with the broader philosophy of the elastic canon. The flash-forward episodes are not meant to be read as a single coherent account of what will actually happen to the characters. They are thought experiments, explorations of possibility, stories that ask what these characters might become under different imaginative conditions. The fortune teller in Lisa's wedding is, after all, a fortune teller at a Renaissance fair, not a reliable prophet. The vision she shows Lisa is the kind of future that might happen, not a fixed destiny. Art to the Future uses a Native American vision, another framework that the show does not commit to as literally true. The framing devices for the flash-forward episodes are, almost without exception, framing devices that allow the show to step back from the commitment they appear to be making. The future being depicted is always at one remove from certainty. This is a reasonable defense of the elastic approach to flash-forward storytelling, and it has a creative logic to it. A show about a family that never ages, set in a perpetual present that shifts with each new season, cannot commit to a single version of a future that the characters will never actually reach. The future episodes are possibilities, not promises. They are the show playing with the question of what these people might become, in the same spirit that the audience plays with that question when watching the present-day episodes. Each flash-forward is a different answer to the same imaginative question, and the answers are allowed to differ because none of them is the authoritative one. The problem with this defense is not that it is wrong, but that it arrives after the fact, as a retroactive framework for decisions that were not originally made within that framework. Lisa's Wedding was not produced with the explicit intention of being one possibility among many future possibilities. It was produced as a genuinely moving story about who Lisa Simpson might become, told with the craft and emotional investment that the show reserved for its most serious work. The Emmy it won was not awarded for a thought experiment. It was awarded for an episode that made people feel something real about a fictional character's future, and the feeling was real because the future felt real. The elastic canon defense, whatever its merits, cannot fully restore the specific emotional weight that accumulated contradictions erode from an episode that was built to carry weight. The 2010 that Lisa's Wedding depicted is now 16 years in the past. The real 2010 came and went, and Lisa Simpson was not a 23-year-old university student in England, and Hugh Parkfield did not propose to her on a bridge, and the Rolling Stones were not yet on a wheelchair tour, though they continued to tour in the way that only the Rolling Stones can. The episode is now a piece of nostalgia about a future that became a past, which gives it a strange doubled temporality. It is an episode from 1995 about 2010, watched now in 2026, which means it is simultaneously a historical document of what 1995 imagined the future would look like, and a record of a fictional future that contradicts every other fictional future the show has produced. Watching it now is watching three different time periods at once, none of which are the same as each other, and all of which are somehow contained in the same 30 minutes of television. The flash-forward episodes that followed Lisa's Wedding, taken as a whole, amount to a collection of alternative futures for the same family, each one internally coherent, and each one incompatible with the others. They form not a single timeline but a branching set of possibilities. A family depicted at multiple futures simultaneously, aging in different directions depending on which episode is consulted. In one future, Lisa is a married academic. In another, she is a divorced president. In another, she is a divorced mother of a difficult daughter. In another, she is a baby when she should be an adult. The Simpsons of the future are not a single family moving through time in a single direction. They are many families, each one generated by a different writer in a different room for a different creative purpose, sharing names and faces and the accumulated history of 35 years of present-day episodes, but pointing toward different horizons that can never be reconciled into a single destination. This is perhaps the most complete expression of what the elastic canon actually means. The show does not know where it is going, because it has decided not to go anywhere in particular, and the flash-forward episodes are the place where that decision is most visible. The future of the Simpson family is whatever the episode needs it to be, in the same way that Springfield's geography is whatever the story needs it to be, and Homer's age is whatever the scene needs it to be, and Marge's phobia is whatever the plot needs it to be. The futures accumulate alongside all the other impossibilities, another beautiful layer of contradiction in a show that has made contradiction its most consistent feature. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The future of the Simpson family has been depicted many times and never the same way twice, with each flash-forward episode quietly making the previous ones harder to believe. Next, the walk arrives at its final question, the one that all of these logic failures have been circling. Why does none of it matter? Why does a show built on contradiction remain one of the most beloved pieces of popular culture ever made? And what does the audience's willingness to forgive every impossible geography, and every shifting birthday, and every ignored ban reveal about why people watch television in the first place? Section 10. Why none of it matters. Somewhere along the way, without any formal announcement, the audience made a decision about The Simpsons. The decision was not conscious, and it was not collective in the sense of being coordinated. It happened independently, in living rooms and bedrooms and on sofas and in front of screens of various sizes across the decades, in the private interior of individual viewing experiences. The decision was this: the logic failures did not disqualify the show. The contradictions, the floating timeline, the ignored bans, the impossible geography, the shifting ages, the retroactive identities, the allergies that appeared and vanished, the futures that contradicted each other. None of it was grounds for withdrawal. The audience stayed. It has kept staying through more than 35 years and more than 800 episodes, through seasons that critics loved and seasons that the same critics found difficult to defend, through controversies and cast changes and the accumulated weight of a run so long that the show predates the internet as most people now experience it. The audience stayed and the logic failures stayed too, and somehow the two things coexisted without the first one driving out the second. Understanding why requires stepping back from the individual inconsistencies and looking at what the show is underneath all of them, because the logic failures are real. This walk has documented them in some detail, and the documentation is accurate. Springfield cannot be simultaneously coastal and landlocked. Homer cannot have been born in 1956 and also been a young adult in 1992. Marge cannot have flown to Washington without apparent distress and also have had a deep childhood phobia of flying. Skinner cannot have grown up in Springfield and also have arrived there as an adult imposter 20 years ago. Bart cannot have eaten shrimp without incident and also have a life-threatening shrimp allergy. These are not matters of interpretation. They are straightforward contradictions, and no amount of goodwill toward the show makes them not contradictions. The question is not whether the logic failures exist. The question is why they do not damage the show in the way that logic failures damage other kinds of storytelling. The answer begins with what the show is actually asking its audience to care about. A mystery novel asks its audience to care about the logic of events. Every clue must be real. Every deduction must follow from real evidence. Every answer must be earned by the question that preceded it. The logic is the point. A continuity failure in a mystery novel is not a stylistic choice or an acceptable compromise. It is a failure of the form, a betrayal of the contract the genre has made with its reader. The audience of a mystery is there for the plot, and the plot depends on internal consistency to function. The Simpsons does not ask its audience to care about plot continuity. It never really did, even in the seasons when the continuity was at its most coherent. What the show asks its audience to care about is something closer to character, to the specific texture of how these people behave and relate to each other, and to the quality of the individual comic and emotional moments that arise from their interactions. A joke about Homer's relationship with donuts does not require the audience to know his exact birth date. A scene between Homer and Lisa about love and disappointment does not require the geography of Springfield to be consistent. The things the show does best are things that do not depend on the internal rules holding. They depend on the characters being recognizable, on the performances being consistent, on the comedy and the feeling being real within the boundaries of the individual scene. And those things have remained largely constant across the entire run, even when everything else was shifting. There is a concept in literary theory about what makes a fictional world believable, and it comes down to something called internal logic rather than external realism. A fictional world does not need to obey the rules of the real world. It needs to obey its own rules consistently enough that the audience can orient themselves within it. The rules of Springfield have never been the rules of the real world. Springfield is a town where a man can work as a safety inspector at a nuclear power plant despite being demonstrably unqualified, where a 10-year-old boy can skateboard through the same neighborhood for 35 years without aging, where every character's past adjusts to fit the present without anyone in the story noticing. These are not the rules of reality. They are the rules of Springfield, and within those rules the show is internally consistent in the ways that actually matter. Homer is always Homer. Marge is always Marge. The relationship between them is always the same relationship, built on the the same foundation of unlikely affection between two people who should not, by any rational measure, be as good for each other as they are. That consistency of character is what the audience is actually tracking, and that consistency has held. The philosopher Kendall Walton wrote about the way that fiction creates what he called a game of make-believe, in which the audience agrees to treat certain things as true within the boundaries of the story. The game is not about believing that the story is literally real. It is about agreeing to respond to it as if its central premises hold, to follow the emotional logic even when the factual logic has gaps. The audience of The Simpsons has been playing this game for decades, and the game is robust enough to absorb contradictions that would terminate other games. The make-believe being sustained is not about Springfield's geography or Homer's birth date. It is about a family, and families are real in ways that birthdays and maps are not. The emotional truth of the Homer and Marge relationship, the specific warmth of the parent-child dynamics, the particular loneliness that the show finds in characters like Ned Flanders and Principal Skinner and Moe, these things are true within the game in a way that geography and age never needed to be. There is also something to be said about the show's relationship with time that goes beyond the simple concept of the floating timeline. The Simpsons exists in a kind of permanent present tense that is unlike almost any other long-running television show. Most long-running dramas and comedies are stories about change. Characters grow, relationships develop. The passage of time is the engine of the narrative, and the story is the record of how people change in response to what happens to them. The Simpsons made a different choice, early and deliberately. The characters would not change in ways that accumulated. The family would not age. The relationships would reset. The permanent present tense would be maintained. This choice made a certain kind of storytelling impossible, the kind that depends on consequence and development and the long arc of a life. But it made another kind of storytelling uniquely available, the kind that can return to the same characters and the same relationships again and again and find something new in the familiar each time, without the weight of accumulated history making the familiar strange. The logic failures are, in a way, the price of this choice. A show that commits to a permanent present tense across 35 years cannot maintain a consistent past. The past keeps having to be renegotiated to fit the present, and the renegotiation leaves marks. Homer's birth date shifts because the permanent present of 2024 cannot coexist with a fixed 1956 birth date without Homer being 68 years old, which would make him a different character with different problems and different possibilities. Springfield's geography shifts because a permanent present tense town needs to be wherever the story is, and the story is different every week. The Skinner retcon happened because the writers wanted a story that required a particular kind of past for the character, and the permanent present tense of the show's format meant that the past was always available for revision. Every logic failure in this walk is, at some level, a consequence of the fundamental choice to keep the present permanently present, and that choice was made in the service of something the show valued more than consistency. What it valued more was availability. The show wanted to be available for any story, any premise, any emotional register, without being constrained by what had come before. This is both a strength and a weakness, and the history of the show is the history of both of those things simultaneously. The strength is the creative freedom it produced, the ability to tell vastly different kinds of stories with the same characters across hundreds of episodes without the characters outgrowing the form. The weakness is the accumulation of contradictions that the freedom generates, the impossible geographies and the shifting ages and the forgotten rules. Both things are real. The show has been honest enough in its better moments to acknowledge both. Matt Selman's phrase "elastic canon" is worth returning to here because it is an unusually candid piece of self-description for a show to offer about its own relationship with its history. Elastic canon does not mean no canon. It means a canon that stretches to accommodate what the story needs, that returns to its general shape without snapping, that holds the essential things fixed while allowing the peripheral things to move. The essential things, in the elastic canon of The Simpsons, are the characters and their relationships. Homer loves Marge and cannot quite believe his luck. Marge loves Homer and cannot quite explain why, but does not need to. Bart is restless and funny and more feeling than he wants anyone to know. Lisa is brilliant and lonely and achingly sincere. Maggie watches everything. These are fixed. These have not moved. The elastic has stretched in every other direction, but these things have held, and they are the things the audience came for, and the things things that kept them coming back. The show's longevity is itself a kind of logic failure when examined carefully. A show that premiered in December of 1989 and is still producing new episodes in 2026 has outlasted the reasonable lifespan of almost any creative project. It has outlasted the relevance of most of the cultural references it made in its early seasons. It has outlasted the careers of some of the people who made it. It has outlasted the childhoods of viewers who grew up watching it and seen those viewers become adults with children of their own who are now watching it. The Springfield that exists in 2026 is not quite the same Springfield that existed in 1989, any more than the America of 2026 is the same America of 1989. Everything has drifted, slowly and continuously, in ways that are hard to see from inside the drift and impossible to miss when the early episodes are placed next to the recent ones. And yet the show is still recognizably itself. Homer is still Homer. Marge is still Marge. The house on Evergreen Terrace, whatever address it happens to have in a given episode, is still the same house, warm and slightly chaotic and full of the specific texture of a life being lived imperfectly by people who love each other more than they always manage to show. The logic has failed in 100 different ways across 100 different episodes, and the essential thing has survived all of them, because the essential thing was never the logic. This is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about what the show's logic failures ultimately reveal. They reveal that the audience's attachment to these characters was never really about whether the facts added up. It was about whether the people felt real, and the people felt real in a way that geography and birthdays could not touch. A viewer who was 10 years old when the show premiered, and who is now in their 40s, has spent decades with this family. They have watched Homer and Marge navigate the same marriage across hundreds of different stories. They have watched Bart and Lisa grow up without growing older, which is a strange and specific magic that only this kind of permanent present-tense storytelling can produce. The logic failures are the debris that accumulates around that magic, the cost of maintaining it across a span of time that no television show was ever really designed to survive. The town cannot find itself on a map. The man at the center of it does not know when he was born. The woman who loves him was afraid of flying before she was afraid of flying, and the man who ran the school was someone else the whole time. And the rules that were supposed to govern who could go where and eat what and be banned from which state have long since dissolved into the general warmth of a world that was never really interested in rules. And none of it, not a single impossible geography or shifted birthday or forgotten ban, has made the family less itself. They remain after all this time exactly who they always were, which is perhaps the deepest logic failure of all, and also the only one that matters. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.